Hey guys, this is Warhawk Beyond 2040 bringing to you another edition of the Spider-Man review series, and today I thought I'd talk about another favourite episode of mine from Season 1, and it's an episode that doesn't really come up very often in conversations when people are talking about classic Spider-Man episodes. I wouldn't necessarily say this episode that I'm about to talk about is a classic, but it's one of my personal favourites for a lot of reasons, and this episode helped set the tone for what Spider-Man the animated series was going to be all about, and it helped introduce a couple of characters who would go on to play very big, important roles in later episodes and some big seasons as we go along here. And the episode that I am going to be talking about today is the one that started it all, and that's the first episode, which is, of course, Night of the Lizard. Now, Night of the Lizard features, of course, the Lizard, who I'll get to talking about in a moment, but this was the first episode of Spider-Man, and what I liked about this episode was it didn't go into the origin of Spider-Man, how Peter Parker got bitten by a radioactive spider. We do see that in a couple of flashbacks over the course of the show, but I like the fact that Spider-Man in the show, he's already established. Peter Parker, I believe, in this show, he's probably, I would say, maybe in his 5th or 6th year as Spider-Man, so I would probably say he's around 21, maybe 22 years old, and this did a fantastic job in helping to set the tone for what the show was going to be all about. And one of the main reasons why this episode is so special to me and why it's so important is because it introduced Eddie Brock, and we all know that Eddie Brock would go on to become Venom, who in my opinion is one of the greatest Spider-Man villains of all time. But what this episode did with Eddie Brock was it helped establish straight away the kind of guy that Eddie Brock is, and it also hinted at who he could become. And we also saw the groundwork laid down for his beef with Spider-Man. Now, as we saw in the course of this episode, we see that Eddie Brock is all about getting results, and he doesn't care how he gets the big story or the big scoop as long as he's number one, as I mentioned in the last video, which I talked about the Venom Saga, aka the Alien Costume 3-parter, and you knew straight away that these two were going to be butting heads quite a lot, and we did see that over the course of the first half of Season 1, and it did a great job in helping to establish the relationship between Eddie Brock and Spider-Man. And another reason why this episode is one of my favourites is because it introduced the Lizard to the show. Now, the Lizard has been one of Spider-Man's main enemies going all the way back to the mid-60s, and he's been one of Spider-Man's most heavy hitters of his rogues gallery. But what I liked about the Lizard, what they did with him in the show, was they didn't make him an evil villain. He wasn't really an evil guy like Venom, the Kingpin, or even the Green Goblin for that matter. He was just the guy that was out of control and was essentially a wild beast. And one of the good things I liked about what the show did was they helped establish the relationship and the connection that the Lizard has with not just Spider-Man, but with Peter Parker as well, which I will get into momentarily. But Lizard was one of my favourite characters on the show, and what I liked about his battles with Spider-Man was Spider-Man wasn't really trying to defeat him like he would with some of the other villains. He was more trying to help him and try to reason with him, and that really helped establish an emotional bond between these two. It's kind of similar to what Batman and Kirk Langstrom went through with each other in Batman the Animated Series. Each time that Kirk Langstrom would become Man-Bat, Batman would go on a mission to go out of his way to help Kirk Langstrom back to normal. And it's kind of the same thing with Spider-Man and the Lizard. So I really enjoyed that aspect of what they did. And I would probably say, out of all of the different animated shows that we've had of Spider-Man, I would probably say this version of the Lizard is my all-time favourite, and he had quite a big role in the show. And you know, it wasn't like what they did with the original Spider-Man movies with Tobey Maguire, where they had Dr. Kurt Connors in all three films and they just did absolutely nothing with him. I absolutely hated that. And even Amazing Spider-Man 1, where the Lizard was the main villain, I like the fact that they brought him in as the main villain. I just didn't like the way the Lizard, or even Kurt Connors, was written. He just came across as a bit of a sleazeball, and he was never about that. But probably the animated series of the 90s is my all-time favourite version of the Lizard, and they did a really good job with the way they wrote his story for him. So, as I said, this is one of my favourite episodes, and as I said, this was the first episode of the show, and it did such a good job in not only planting the seeds for Eddie Brock becoming Venom, but it also helped establish the relationship that the Lizard / Kurt Connors has with Spider-Man, and especially Peter Parker as well. And another thing that I enjoyed a lot about this episode was the backstory of the Lizard. And we see in a series of flashbacks, we see Dr. Kurt Connors is working with reptiles, something that we didn't see in any of the 3 Spider-Man films. Just thought I'd get that out there. And we see that Peter Parker is Kurt Connors' lab assistant. And we basically see Kurt Connors transfer some DNA from a reptile and give it to a hamster who's got one leg, and it restores his leg. And we see that Kurt Connors is a good-hearted man and a brilliant scientist, and he's all about trying to heal creatures and people who've lost limbs in maybe an accident or wars. And we see that Kurt Connors has one arm. Now, what I would have liked to have seen in this episode, which we didn't, but it's okay with me, it doesn't really bother me at all, but I would have liked to have seen, maybe at the beginning of the episode, maybe we could have seen how Kurt Connors lost his arm, and that could have set the tone for him being determined to restore his other arm. But we didn't get to see that, and that's absolutely fine, you know, it's not a big issue. And we learn that from Dr. Kurt Connors' wife that he used the neogenic recombinator on himself after injecting himself with reptile DNA, and that causes him to become the Lizard. So I really enjoyed that a lot. I thought the way they told that story about how Kurt Connors became the Lizard was very well done, and I liked the horror aspects that they embraced in this episode, and it certainly wouldn't be the last time we would see Spider-Man embrace the horror aspects of things, which would be a sign of things to come. And I like in a way how Peter Parker feels partially responsible for Kurt Connors becoming the Lizard. I mean, he wasn't really. I mean, he was just helping him out with reptiles and stuff, but you can see the weight of Peter Parker dealing with the fact that Kurt Connors becoming the Lizard is partially his fault. So in a way he kind of feels responsible, and he's more than determined to not only stop the Lizard but also help save his friend. So that was a really cool thing they did for the show, and it's certainly not the last time we would see that with Spider-Man and Kurt Connors. And in a way, Kurt Connors would go on to become one of Spider-Man's closest allies and associates. So anytime that Spider-Man came across some science stuff that he himself may not be able to understand, he would go straight to Kurt Connors for help. It's kind of similar to the relationship Superman and Professor Emil Hamilton had in the Superman animated series. You need the science guy to explain all the complicated stuff, and Kurt Connors fit the bill perfectly. And Kurt Connors in a way looks at the relationship as like, well, you could have turned me into the police about me being the Lizard, but you didn't. You just wanted to help me, and for that I owe you big time. I'll never forget what you did for me. So that was a nice way to establish the relationship between Curt Connors and Spider-Man. And also there was always that little hint that Curt Connors could become the Lizard once again, and I like that they didn't completely close the door on the Lizard. It wasn't just like, yep, Lizard's defeated, Curt Connors is back to normal, done. I like the fact they kept that door just a little bit open, so there was always that idea that he's okay now, but could he change again? So I really liked that a lot. So that was very awesome storytelling and great way to establish the relationship between Curt Connors and Spider-Man, as I said already. And another thing that I liked about the way the Lizard was written in the show was his motivations. Now, unlike other Spider-Man villains who are just out on a mission to humiliate or eliminate Spider-Man, or want to control everything, someone like the Kingpin or the Green Goblin, or even be the #1 hunter in the world like Kraven, Lizard's motivations were a little bit different. He wanted to heal everyone, just like how he healed himself. And I remember in the episode, he said, if I could just use the Neogenic Recombinator and heal people the way it healed me, it would transform everyone and create a new species of lizard. So I thought that was a very interesting motivation for the Lizard. And also I liked the way his voice was well balanced, because I've seen versions later on where his voice just sounded ridiculously over the top, and I thought they found a nice good balance between the Lizard persona and the Curt Connors persona. So when he's with his wife, you could hear the Curt Connors in his voice, but you could still hear little traces of the Lizard there. And then as soon as Spider-Man enters the room, boom, his mind goes automatically back to being a reptile, and he goes straight after Spider-Man and goes to attack him. So I thought they found a very good balance with the Lizard character. And as I said at the beginning, Lizard isn't really, how should I put it, an evil guy, because he's not truly evil. He's just out of control. But he has a very clear motivation of what he wants. So obviously that puts him into odds with Spider-Man. So yeah, this is one of the reasons why Lizard is one of my favourite villains, because he's very different to other villains like the Kingpin and the Green Goblin, or even Venom for that matter. So that sets him apart from the others. I was also equally impressed with the way Spider-Man was written in this episode, and especially when he's Peter Parker. Like in this scene, for example, where we see him and Deborah Whitman go to Curt Connors' office, and they see a shadowy figure, which is obviously Connors has just transformed into the Lizard, and he accidentally knocks out Deborah, and Peter goes to rush and tackle the Lizard, even though he's not in the Spider-Man costume, and he's just about to jump onto the window ledge and go after him, but he realises that Deborah is still in the room. I thought that was a really good scene, and I like the way that Peter Parker is a badass in and out of costume. So he's not afraid to rush into action even if he's not in his Spider-Man costume. So I really enjoyed that aspect a lot of the show, and unlike other versions, especially in the recent MCU films, I mean, I enjoy all of them, I really do, but they try to make him too much like Iron Man Jr. In this show, and especially even in the comic books at the time, Peter Parker was very much his own man and stood on his own 2 feet, and he always did things his way, and he didn't really want other people's help, and I really respect that. And you know, the only other character you ever saw that sort of personality was with Batman, so I'm glad they adapted that for Spider-Man, because he is his own man and he doesn't really need people's help, and obviously he's never going to turn help away if he needs it, but Spider-Man is his own man, and I really enjoyed that aspect of the show. And I like the fact that he has so much weight on his shoulders and on his mind, but he's all about doing the right thing. Like, as I said earlier, he blames himself for Kurt Connors turning himself into the Lizard, even though he had nothing to do with it. But just the fact that Spider-Man is mature enough to take responsibility for things that even he didn't do shows you the kind of hero that he is, and I really enjoyed that they embraced those aspects of the show. So very well done on their parts for the way Spider-Man / Peter Parker was written. Now, this scene was funny, but at the same time did an awesome job in pushing the beef further with Eddie Brock and Spider-Man. And we saw earlier in the episode, Eddie Brock learned that Kurt Connors was the Lizard and he was planning to expose him, but Spider-Man destroyed his camera and said to him that I won't let you ruin a man's life. And Eddie Brock went to Jameson and said, look, I've got actual proof that Kurt Connors is the Lizard, and Jameson of course isn't buying it. And there's that funny part where Brock says, well look, I'll show you the Lizard himself, and if I'm wrong I'll eat today's issue of the Daily Bugle. And then they open the door and Kurt Connors is standing there, said, oh, good morning Jameson, what brings you to my home? And that funny line right at the end where Jameson says, tell me Brock, how do you like your paper? Cooked or raw? So I thought that was a really funny scene, but at the same time, as I said, they did a really good job of planting the seeds further for Eddie Brock's beef with Spider-Man and his slow descent into becoming Venom. So very good scene, very funny at the same time. And I liked the ending of this episode, which comes straight after the scene where Aunt May tells off Peter for following Spider-Man into the sewers and says that line, what if that horrible Spider-Man had caught you following him? And Peter says to himself, well, Spider-Man has already caught me up in his web, and for better or for worse, we're stuck with each other forever. So I thought that was a really powerful line to end a really fantastic episode. And that's it really. That's my thoughts on Night of the Lizard. And as I've said at the beginning, that Night of the Lizard may not be considered a lot of people's favourites when they're talking about classic episodes from the 90s Spider-Man show, but I like this episode a lot because it did a fantastic job in establishing Kurt Connors and Eddie Brock. Number one being, we see how Kurt Connors became the Lizard, and we also saw the seeds being planted with Eddie Brock's beef with Spider-Man, which ultimately leads him to becoming Venom. And I read somewhere that for the first episode they wanted to bring in Venom as the first villain, but the network decided against it and said no, let's just build up Eddie Brock becoming Venom first before we introduce him. So I thought that was a really good call to make, and I'm glad they did that, because me personally, I don't think that would have worked, just having a big villain like Venom straight away. I'm glad they saved the best till last. So whoever made that decision, it was the right call to make in my opinion. But aside from Night of the Lizard being one of my favourite episodes, you know, it's the first episode, and you know, sometimes first episodes aren't always as good, but this was a very good episode, and this is definitely in my top 10 favourites of season 1. I would probably put this episode maybe in the top 5 of my favourites. Obviously number 1 will be the Venom Saga, which I covered in the last video, so I would probably put this episode as number 2. I'd probably put this as number 2. Not as strong as the Venom Saga, but as I said, it did a great job building what the show was going to be all about, so I'll definitely put this in my number 2 of favourite episodes of season 1. So there you have it, guys. What did you think of Night of the Lizard? Did you enjoy it? Did you think it did a good job in establishing Eddie Brock and Kurt Connors as the Lizard and Venom respectively? And hope you've enjoyed listening to me talking about the first episode of the 90s Spider-Man cartoon and going on this trip through memory lane. You know what to do, guys. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave your thoughts and comments down below, and I will be back next time for another edition of the Spider-Man review series, where I'll be talking about another favourite episode of mine from the first season, so make sure you don't miss that. So until next time, take care everybody, and stay safe.